All right, guys, let's talk about the brand spanking new US Eat Real Food pyramid. It has undergone a major update. It's essentially flipped the previous one on its head, and I love it. The overarching message is refreshingly boring, which in nutrition is usually a good sign. It is to eat minimally processed whole foods. This is not controversial, and as a public health guideline, it is really hard to fault. Where the US has made a genuinely meaningful leap forward is in protein. The old recommendation of zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kg of body weight per day has long been recognized as a minimum to avoid deficiency, not an optimal intake for health, body composition, or aging. The new range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kg of your body weight per day for moderately active adults is far more in line with current evidence. This matters for muscle maintenance, metabolic health, recovery, and functional independence as we age. In other words, this isn't bro science. This is not bodybuilding recommendations. This is basic physiology finally catching up with policy, and I think it is absolutely class. What's particularly interesting here, and not something I've heard others highlight or talk about, is this change is not cheap. Protein is the most expensive macronutrient to source, store, and distribute at scale. Increasing protein recommendations has real downstream consequences for government-funded food systems such as school meals, hospitals, care homes, the military, food aid programs, and international assistance. Raising a protein intake across an entire population is logistically complex and financially uncomfortable, but despite that, they went ahead and did the right thing. Awesome, right? This context likely explains why protein recommendations have remained so low for so long, despite a strong and growing body of evidence supporting higher intakes. You see, public health guidelines are not written in a vacuum. They are constrained by budgets, supply chains, and political feasibility. From that perspective, the US committing to higher protein targets it's a fairly bold move. It's always easier and cheaper to recommend more pasta and more bread. This also helps explain why the UK may be hesitant to raise its own protein RNI reference nutrient intake from the current 0.75 grams of protein per kg of your body weight per day to a similar 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kg of your body weight per day, as doing so would force uncomfortable conversations about cost, procurement, and whether the existing public food systems are even equipped to deliver protein at scale. Evidence is necessary for policy change, but it's rarely sufficient on its own. Now there is a bit of online outrage stemming from the visual emphasis on saturated fat, with butter being really high on the pyramid, but context matters here. The written guidance still caps saturated fat at under 10% of total energy intake, which is sensible. To suggest actively pursuing a high saturated fat diet would not be prudent, but complete avoidance would be challenging and ill-advised, as you'd end up avoiding so many very nutritious and high protein foods such as steak, and eggs, and dairy, all the good stuff. On that note, full fat dairy has also raised some eyebrows. But here again, the evidence is more nuanced than you'd guess from looking at saturated fat in isolation. Full fat dairy performs very well in research, and better than you'd predict based solely on its saturated fat content, likely because foods are not just nutrient spreadsheets. The food matrix matters here. But perhaps one of the boldest shifts is the language around added sugars. Rather than framing them as something to be limited, the guidance now states that no amount of added sugar is needed as part of a healthy diet, given the lack of nutritional upside and very clear downsides. This feels long overdue. No one's health ever improved because they carefully optimize their Haribo intake. Believe me, I tried. I'll just put a copious amount of sugar in their morning coffee. By comparison, the UK's Eat Well guide feels dated. It still gives starchy carbohydrates like an excessive portion of the plate and remains relatively conservative on explicit protein targets. It feels like protein is treated as optional rather than essential, especially when you read more. An improved UK model would look actually uncomfortably similar to the updated US one, clearer protein targets with greater emphasis on whole and minimally processed foods. They should still probably keep it as a plate. I think a plate visually is better. It makes more sense than the pyramid, but a major update is really needed here, particularly with protein. If the UK starts by increasing protein recommendations, that may cost it a pretty penny, but it will greatly benefit the country as a whole, particularly older adults who really need those higher protein intakes for muscle maintenance and functional independence. We need to do more to support our aging population.